Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Pittsburgh Current podcast. I am Pittsburgh Current editor and publisher Charlie Deitch. We've got a good show for you today, and we have our drinks issue is currently on the stands now. You can get that for another few days. There aren't a whole lot left from what I hear, so if you want to grab that, you can grab that, or all the content, of course, is available at pittsburghcurrent.com. And our new issue comes out Tuesday, April 2nd. We thought about doing an April Fool's issue, but we really thought about the ethics of doing it on April 2nd. So we took the high road and decided to wait until the calendar gives us permission, because we're conformist. A couple of quick things. If you're a fan of local music, tonight at 5:30 is the latest installment of the Pittsburgh Current concert series. Musical artist Momon Naden takes our stage tonight. And coming up, future shows, we have Ryan Hoffman and the Pioneers on April 3rd at 6 p.m. And on April 23rd, we have the incomparable Brittany Chantel. So those are great shows coming up. But our guest today is Olivia Benson. She's a former state Senate candidate in the 37th District, and we'll talk a little more about the 37th District for sure in a moment. But she made news earlier this year when she withdrew from that race and announced she was eyeing a potential statewide campaign for Auditor General. She's worked on several political campaigns, worked as a congressional staffer, and I personally think she's going to be around Allegheny County elected office and politics for some time to come. Olivia, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you for taking the ethics and the high road, not doing April Fool's. So
yeah, thank you. That's one of those things that I think they're going to put on my, it's going to be part of my obituary. I think he took the high road on April 2nd.
Appreciate it. That's the best. So. It's a good one to have.
So. I of course, as we talked about before, you and I met when you first were working on a political campaign. The first campaign, I think, for Allegheny County Executive Rich Fitzgerald. But you did a lot before then. You've done a lot since then. And this year you decided to throw your name in the hat for that 37th District state Senate seat. And for those of you, that became vacant when Republican Guy Rechtensteller, who, Google him. He won a congressional seat, and so that seat became open. And Olivia was one of three, I believe, Democrats who threw her name in for party endorsement. And so I think that's probably a good place to start. Sure. So the day of the nomination conference, Olivia goes up to speak, and she decides she withdraws her name. And that's let's start there. Let's talk about, I could probably describe the background, but why don't you describe a little bit about the background that led up to your decision that day?
Sure. So I was super excited. I think the prior May, I had really started thinking about getting into the Senate race. And there's a lot of things that you need to do kind of prior to that. You need to get a committee list, go to committee events, really kind of network. And I struggled from that point, even kind of getting an up-to-date committee list. Right. So, you go through the debates, you have conversations with folks that are on the committee, the people that are supposed to be your cheerleaders in the district. And, I'd get a lot of feedback, wow, Olivia, you had great answers in the forums, and Olivia really appreciated the perspective you brought into this. But, how are you going to win this district? And I said, well, I'm going to knock doors. Right. I realize there's a little bit of a Republican advantage in the past cycle, but I really think I can get out there and do the work. And then it became about, well, what about your background is going to help you overcome these things? It was I'm from the area, grew up in Aliquippa, I learned to swim at the Swickley Y, so I've been around the area. And then it finally came out, well, how are you as a Black woman going to be able to get folks to support you? And when you're hearing that from, I think, folks that are committee members, that's a real challenge, because these are the folks that are supposed to help you carry the torch and really knock on the door. So I kept kind of getting those comments. I got comments about, well, it just seems like, you're not as organized as the other candidates, that you don't have the infrastructure they have. And, I had conversations. I've done enough campaigns to know that, I had a great team ready to go behind me, but I wasn't, I guess, necessarily kind of taking them on a walking tour of the district. And folks were a little concerned about that. So when I got up there on the day of the nominating convention, I was really kind of set on, I really want to do this. But if I get these same questions this morning, I'm not doing this. I have a background in policy and work. And
so when you went there that morning, you didn't plan to withdraw?
I did not plan to withdraw if I did not get those kind of same questions. But I'd always really, I'd say even more so than the Senate race, I'd always thought about a statewide office because I think statewide office, especially the Auditor General, you can do some really cool things that are really policy driven and not as partisan. So it was something that was definitely, in the back of my mind and I thought about, but I did make my decision that morning.
Right. So I'll tell you what I heard, and I think that you that you very clearly, I think, relayed where a lot of it's going. But they basically said that that was a big fear, and again it's all the kind of double speak before, well, how will you overcome your challenges, and then it becomes all these. But really, they're asking the question. Did you realize initially that they were asking you that question of how can they didn't think a black person, a black woman could win in this, and my guess is that I don't know if they would have given the same questions to an African American male or not, but I feel that district is I think that was probably their fear, which again I don't think is necessarily not necessarily, it's not in my opinion, it's not a credible consideration in my opinion. How did you address that when they sort of brought up a little bit the issue of race, the issue of your race being deciding factor on whether or not you should get the nomination or not?
I think that I've been a black woman my entire life, so I was comfortable with being asked the question. Like, that's mine. Like, the demographics of Western Pennsylvania. What I was not comfortable with was how that those characteristics would in some sort of way make me, less of a candidate and make me less attractive to the folks that were going to be voting. And it would give folks some challenges in how they were going to talk to their neighbors and their friends about why they would support me. So that hurt a little bit. And I did actually get some feedback from other candidates who are minorities and men of color specifically that told me that they'd experienced similar questions. So I wasn't the first one, but I was guaranteed, I guess, in that morning and that opportunity to really kind of, mention my desire to run for a different office and not this, really highlight those issues and say, for the next Olivia that comes along that, you say is you're concerned about her age, the color of her skin and her gender, like, I'm 11 months younger, I think, than Connor Lamb. So we're not that far apart. I may look young, like, thanks, Mom. But that shouldn't be kind of what stops you. And if the qualifications for the candidate are there, then, like, you as, like, the champions of the party, like, I want you guys to really own this and like go hard for that candidate like you would anyone else that kind of fits the mold of what you're thinking.
Do you feel like that they actually gave your background, your bona fides, do you think they actually gave those a fair shake, a fair hearing, a fair going over?
Oh, absolutely. I think, a lot of folks were, really impressed with the kind of the work that I'd done since I'd graduated. And I don't want to kind of really stress, it wasn't a blanket of kind of all the committee. It was certain folks, and I was like, this is really problematic because these are those same questions you've asked me multiple times. But more importantly, like, I think that there would have been some hesitation, and it might have been a harder kind of road to go uphill. And this was a really short campaign. I think at the end of the day, it's 10 weeks. Right.
And just, The other question I guess that I had during that process is, I think at that point, even though the Republicans hadn't chosen their candidate, I think all signs pointed to the fact that they were going to that they were going to give their nomination to D. Raja, who, of course, if working on Rich Fitzgerald's first campaign, he ran against Rich for county executive. I mean, as someone who the Republicans sort of put up someone of color, someone not from this country. Did you think about that at all? If you're talking about could a black woman win in that district? It didn't seem necessarily like in the South Hills or the Republicans in the South Hills worried about whether or not a man from India could win in that district.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that was kind of the tangential conversation that was happening as well. Like, we pretty much had new indications that Raja was going to get it. And I think barring some really kind of, epic and record work from Devlin Robinson or another candidate that was in it, Raja was going to be their nominee. So when I was getting these questions and really, stressing that, my qualifications are going to carry me, guys, I'm going to be fine. That did not seem to be as much of a factor as, Raja being in the race as folks were kind of setting it up to be. I think that Democrats genuinely wanted a candidate that could be, whether it was Raja or Devlin Robinson or anyone else. I just got the feeling and the feedback from a lot of folks that were in the committee that I didn't fit, and they were concerned about my background playing out in that. And, what if questions came up from their neighbors? Are they more likely to support me? Or if it's not Raja, would they support, Devlin, who's equally qualified? So it was a hard read, but I went with my gut that day. And I said, I'm going to take the concerns about my race and gender and age off the table. And hey, Democrats, let's put forward a candidate that can, hopefully get back the seat.
Right. And speaking of that special election is this Tuesday, April 2nd.
Yes, vote if you live in 37th.
Hopefully our April 3rd issue would not be an April Fool's that Raja has. Well, that guy he just won't go away from campaigns. He's tried every sort of. Every time something comes up in that district, that seat in particular, I think now this is the second or third time he's run for that seat.
Well, this seat comes up so often. It seems like.
Do you think that's because is it sort of a springboard to other offices, and if so, why, or what is it about that seat that comes?
I think people that there's folks that maybe have had the opportunity to use it as a springboard to other office. It's a great seat. I think that you have a lot of kind of economic diversity in the communities, a lot of folks that maybe work in the city, that live out in the burbs, and they're in the South. So I think it's a great seat. I think that for whatever reason, people just get tapped to run for office, or run for higher office, or become take over institutions. So I don't know what that says about the seat, but I think that the people that have been there have been fortunate to do kind of awesome work after.
So let's talk a little bit about the race coming up on Tuesday. Pam Ivino, of course, is running against Raja. The district. I mean, so I don't know that I could have anybody more qualified to talk about the district than you right here. So talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, a little bit about the district and why you think, I assume, I know you're supporting Pam Ivino, why you think she's maybe the best candidate over Raja in this case.
I want to say that, there are so many volunteers out there that have knocked thousands of doors from this race, from Matt Smith's part of his race, Connor Lamb's race. So they know the ins and outs and the intricacies of the district better than me. But I think that, what Pam represents does give Democrats a really strong shot at the seat. Her background, her work kind of countywide and nationwide with veterans really does play up. I think at the end of the day, I could speculate about everything, but it really is going to depend on turnout. And, yard signs don't vote, guys. We'd love if they did, but they don't vote. But I think that, whoever turns out their people, Democrats, Republicans, maybe folks that are on the fence, that's going to be the winner. And whoever can do that, especially over the next, 4 or 5 days, that's, the race isn't over yet. So I think it's anyone's game.
Yeah, it's gonna be a fun one to watch. And in special elections, as you said, they always carry that little extra. You could have no turnout, or you could have one party or another. Usually, obviously, that's what it is. They show up better than the other party, and so it's interesting. I always wonder about the effectiveness of having a special election when you have a primary election that's not too far off, but. I'm sure there's some advantages. Yeah.
I mean, I think that would have been great for Democrats, especially if this special was held on a primary day. But, the world doesn't work out perfectly. And I think this is a good opportunity to see kind of what ground games look like for both parties ahead of 2020, when you're likely going to have a woman, or maybe even a woman of color at the top of the ticket, going up against President Trump. So who's got the better ground game and kind of can build those volunteers? And this is a really good test run for that.
This is the Pittsburgh Current Podcast. Charlie Deach here with Olivia Benson. We're talking about politics. We're going to talk more about politics, and we're going to talk a little bit about I'll make it our next question, Olivia. When did you gain an interest in becoming involved in politics?
Let's see.
Because you grew up in Aliquippa.
I did,
correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so was it there as growing up, being a student there, growing up there, or was it in college, or?
My parents, from the time I can remember, really didn't involve me in any of their political activity, and they weren't necessarily knocking doors, but they were going to community meetings about issues. And I remember going into the voting booth and being super hyped to just see this process transpire. So I grew up knowing that as someone that's born in this country and raised in this country, or that's here in this country, like if you can vote, you should vote and you should play a role. So I vividly have those memories. My dad is actually from Mississippi, so my grandmother talks about like what you see in the civil rights backdrops, like that's her house.
Wow.
But like they talk about like just like getting the access and the rights to vote was so difficult for a number of people, specifically people of color in Deep South Mississippi, and integrating these places, these high schools, that was a challenge. So just kind of the work and the blood that's been lost over that really did play a role in me taking this very seriously. I remember we'd have the mock elections in middle school. Right. I was always super excited to have those. So I've always really had a passion about it. I think in college when I was, around the George Bush, John Kerry race played a role. And then Obama came along and I happened to be working at a congressional office at the time for Jason Altmaier, which was PA04. And I was just enthralled by it. I said, this is great. Like, and more young people can really pay attention to this. There's more opportunity and there's a brighter future for us.
I remember those middle school elections, and it's weird.
So contentious.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Did you vote straight ticket as far as you remember? Like I'm trying to think back to when I was in school, and it's like I remember those, and kids. Most times it was kids, sort of talking about who their parents were supporting, and that I think is tough to. When you have sort of a family with a strong political dynamic, it's hard sometimes too, because my family's political dynamic was far from progressive, and so it's an odd thing to sort of jump out from that. But I assume, obviously, growing up in a left-leaning progressive household, that obviously shaped your political self, I guess.
Yeah. But I think when my parents, so I never thought of them as progressive as much as I thought of them as like pragmatic and saying like, okay, this is the policy around it. Yeah. And this is why it's good. And if it's, George H.W. or George W. or Bill Clinton or whomever, this is why this is a good policy, or this is why this is a bad policy. And we can't let parties specifically decide that they're going to take control of the good or the bad, and they're going to own that narrative. So it just so happens that a lot of the policies I like are progressive and it's on the Democratic side. But they really did challenge me to think critically at an early age about why I would support a candidate, or why, my middle school election, I'm going to hold the torch for Bill Clinton when everyone else is Bob Dole or whatever. To really think critically about like, why am I doing this? How is this policy going to impact people? And then what are the outcomes and what's the long-term kind of play of this?
How do you, and I assume that you've obviously carried that into today. And it's easy, I think, when you're looking at President Trump, I think we see it very clearly that regardless of what he says, his supporters are going to be all over. They're never going to deviate. And I think that seems to be missing a bit, because I remember Bill Clinton was the first president I ever voted for, and he was horrible on immigration. He signed one of the most restrictive immigration laws to boot people out of this country. And so that did, I didn't then in the second term. I didn't, not vote for him. But, that sort of, I think we're missing that in politics. So do you, and I know a lot of people, if it comes from one side or another, they just sort of like tune it out. I assume that you're out there, you're looking at, you're willing to look at anything to sort of see what's the best policy for the...
Oh, absolutely. I think, when you think about President Trump, and everyone's like, he's gearing up for his next presidential campaign. And I don't think of President Trump right now as doing any sort of presidential campaigning. He's just running a very effective marketing campaign. Yeah. And folks, it's like Black Friday, like folks fall for it. Like, this TV is no more valuable on, 2 weeks from now, but because it seems like it's a good deal and I have to have it and it's exactly what I want, I'm going to support that. And he's done a very effective job of running that marketing campaign. I think that, what I'm always intrigued by is, I want, as a citizen of this country, like, I want our president to do well, and I want, the party in power, whomever that might be, to do well and elevate the status of communities, especially marginalized communities. But when that's not happening, and when it seems like there's an all-on attack and assault about the folks that make this to the folks that, really do make this country what it is, that's problematic. And it's very hard for, I think, Democrats or Republicans especially to find common ground when everything is just so much about the sound bites and the Twitter and the marketing of it.
How do we change that conversation? And what do we do? If you have, as someone who, and we'll talk about the potential Auditor General's race in a second, but how do you, as a future candidate, how do you change that? Like, how do you change the narrative of politicians, doing things like that?
I when I was running for the 37th, I made it very clear that, you're going to go to the Democratic committee meetings. You're going to go to the rallies, et cetera. But I'm also going to try and sneak into some of the Republican committee meetings because I want to know what they're talking about. Like, they represent just as much of this constituency as the Democrats. And, I would hope that the policies and the proposals that are put forth and that I was hoping to put forward, like, we could take the politics out of it and really just talk about the people. There's no one I know, Republican, Democrat, Independent, wherever, that wants to see someone that's working 40 hours a week or more living in poverty, right? Like, that's ridiculous. And if they're not working 40 hours a week, and if they have other issues along with that, or they're just working and trying to survive, like, they shouldn't be living in poverty in one of the richest countries in the world. How can we make our air a little cleaner, our water a little cleaner? Like, these are not things that are partisan, but taking the headlines and kind of the narratives that are already there around them and just really getting down to the policies of it, I think is what we're going to have to do, because, politics right now is a really effective marketing campaign, depending on what side you're on. And we can do better than that, just talking about the policies and the policy decisions.
Why do you think it's so hard to agree on things that should be very easy to agree about, like those things you just mentioned? Just let's make the air a little cleaner.
Yeah, I think, confirmation bias is one thing. We also seem to do a lot of groupthink and really just kind of being around our own circles and really with our friends that are going to agree with us. But I also don't think that people are talking about it in that way. Like, it's really easy to, say, are you pro-fracking or anti-fracking? Like, what? Like, I think any business wants, should want essentially to have, the best and cleanest and brightest air around their facility as possible. And communities deserve that as well. So if we can agree on clean air and clean water, check. All right, let's go from there. But we never seem to even talk about just kind of those basic dynamics of things. And I think it's on us to really be more thoughtful in the words that we use, and also more forceful in taking the headlines out of it and just talking about the policies.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the problem is, there's more to natural gas drilling than fracking, but it really all gets boiled down to that one sort of soundbite. And that's, there aren't really any deep discussions about, any meaningful deep discussions. Again, as you said, it's you probably with folks of a like mind. It's me with folks of a like mind. And, we have those conversations, but it's not, it seems much harder. For me, it almost seems, and I gave up probably a few years ago trying to sway anybody on anything. And I think that apathy obviously hurts us, but it can get frustrating. So do you still, how do you do that?
I think there's another angle of it too. It's calling out politicians, and specifically folks that position themselves as political leaders, to make sure that they're also challenging the status quo. I think, I was watching something, getting pieces of it on Facebook. I didn't have time to follow up, but talks about fracking in the parts of the Mon Valley in Braddock, just after, less than 2 months ago, where there was an air quality warning where no one heard about. And, political leadership, in some cases, very recently with the past electeds, have really stepped up and said, well, wait a second, you're not just going to come in these communities and we're well informed and we have this information. We want to talk about the environmental aspects and how this is going to impact the health of our kids, our seniors, our families, et cetera. And I think having that political leadership now is really helping us get down to beyond just, the conversations about fracking. It's well, what is this actually doing to our community? And is this something we want? So I think effective leadership is really a nice dose of medicine for political apathy.
And I think that segues in nicely to talking a little bit about the state auditor general race that you're eyeing, because I think that there are few politicians, I think, that exemplify a bit of what you're talking about, like Eugene DePasquale, the current state auditor general. He took an office that
It's like watching paint dry. Yeah.
Exactly. And he sort of turned it into like the Auditor General is going to come out with something tomorrow. Let's see what it is. It's sort of, he made it effective, I think. Effective in a way that people can actually feel the effects of what he does. And was it Eugene's work that sort of made you realize that that's an office that you'd like to pursue?
I think, Eugene's work was incredibly inspiring because I do think that he, took the kind of requirements of that office and really kind of transformed them into, a political office that can actually present policies that politicians and the governor's office and whomever across the state can actually run with and do some great work for constituencies and communities. I think it's his report on gun safety I thought was fantastic. And, Republican, Democrat, Independent, pro NRA, anti, whatever. Like he talked about really tangible solutions that can be, enacted from everything to your smallest municipality to state government. Yeah. And that's a lot of times what I think constituents and residents in Pennsylvania are looking for is what can we actually do at this moment? Like we can talk about this and be exhausted at the end of the day, but here are some things that we can all do in our own little space, in our own little sector and make these changes, and a lot of them will not cost additional dollars. They might actually save money. Yeah. And I think that really kind of taking that perspective and what he's done with that office is it's been great. And I think when I was doing the 37th and I was talking about some of my policy positions that I wanted, I realized kind of early on that a lot of these, may not be enacted because of the makeup of the Senate and the House right now. But coming from the Auditor General's office, they could be, potentially worked on at higher levels of office and put out and enacted and help Pennsylvanians. I think one area too is the push toward legalization of recreational use of marijuana. And, there have been folks like Jake Wheatley and Ed Gainey who've been introducing bills and talking about this for a long time. But I think that when Eugene sort of did his report and talked about the kind of money that can be made and because unfortunately sometimes you just have to break it down to cash. And I think that that really has given this, this movement a huge boost. I think that sort of has made it okay to talk about in the mainstream for a lot of politicians. Absolutely. I think the money is a huge part of it. And one of the things that I talked about was, if we have this, $250 million that we can expect to come in annually, then, why not use this to fund CHIP, right? Like CHIP is Pennsylvania's baby. It's something that, even with the drama that's going on with the ACA right now, like this is something that, we shouldn't hold our children essentially hostage due to the political whims in Washington. So having that money to maybe fund CHIP or fund, some sort of property tax relief or, fill any number of Pennsylvania's woes, I think is important. And then also to give credit to, Representative Wheatley and Representative Gainey, like I think they've talked very eloquently and honestly about, if we do deregulate this, what's the chance for decriminalization, because a lot of this has directly impacted communities of color and really snatched a generation of people and put them in jail. And I also mentioned too, folks were concerned about the regulation. Like Pennsylvania does regulation on liquor better than anyone. Like that's our thing. Like that's what we're embarrassingly known for. So there's opportunities to have this pool of money coming in, decriminalize it, and also make it safe so that a lot of the fears that folks might have can be removed. Right. So where are you in the process of deciding whether or not you'll run? Where are you in the process? Take us, if you don't mind, take us through that process a little bit. Like, what things sort of need to happen? What are the steps for you to decide whether or not you'll? Sure. So I just have to go through the state's process of making sure that the PAC is set up and things are moving forward, kind of, the things you do as a candidate anyway. So build an email list, kind of identify supporters, think about your strategic plan on how you're going to reach the millions of voters of Pennsylvania and also raise money. So I've gone through that process, and, I'm going to probably be making an official announcement soon. There's a couple of other elections coming up that I want folks to focus on. But that's something that, I've been working on for a while, and I do think, you guys will be getting something soon. Good. But what goes behind the personal decision making for you as far as, do I want to go through this process? What has that process been like for you to decide if it's something that you think you
want to do, because it's
Yeah.
it's gonna be a
it's
huge
definitely a
undertaking.
hard process. And I think, you can be as idealistic as you want about the race, and, think that, you are the better candidate that's, even thinking about running at this time, and that you should just naturally kind of, be like ordained into the seat. But that never
Right.
happens in politics, and it's not what you want. I think that for me, it's really been about thinking about what kind of like sunk costs are there. Will there be friends that you will lose? Will there be, job opportunities? How am I going to make sure that, I can still live
Right.
and function while
Yeah.
I'm running for this race? So you do think about kind of those things. And then you also think about, well, what if I don't do this? Like what is the opportunity lost? And, maybe at least not getting out there and presenting these ideas that are good for Pennsylvania, in my mind, that are good for Pennsylvania. So it's a long process. You have to think about it. You have to talk to friends, family. After the 37th, my mom was like, are you sure you want to do this again? Like, are you sure this is something you want? Like this is Olivia, like, you don't have to do this. And it's really just kind of having those conversations and being honest. And like, again, thinking about how am I going to raise the money to do this? So,
because it is, it's anymore, you almost have to be a full-time candidate when you're running for an office of that size. And that's a tough decision for a lot of people, because it's going to be a financial burden, and has been, I'm sure, for folks. And so, that's the amount of time and effort that goes into something like that.
And I think that's why you see a lot of folks that are either kind of, already politicians that are kind of guaranteed to get some sort of salary, like stepping into races, or that can kind of self-fund and live off of their, own wealth to do these things. And that shouldn't be what our political representation looks like. Like, it has to be just more everyday folks jumping into the race.
Who inspired you when you were younger, and who inspires you now politically? Who sort of do you look up to when you think of, if you're going to get into this game, who you sort of want to be like? And maybe who we talked a little bit about when you were younger, but who do you sort of look up to politically?
Right now, I really, it's almost to the point of like obsessed. I think Stacey Abrams is so fascinating. And the work that she's been doing, not just over the past 2 years, but her entire life has really just been the definition of public service. And even, taking wins and losses, and, whether there was cheating or not cheating happening in Georgia, like, she just kept going. So she looked at these opportunities and realized, it's bigger than me, and my feelings in this, and I need to run because these are things that are impacting everyday Georgians and Americans. And I think that what she's done is super inspiring. Back in the day, I think it was really my grandmother, kind of my grandmothers on both sides. So my grandmother, who was, lived in Aliquippa, was my mother's mother. She was an entrepreneur. She was still very active. And, every like election season, like, she was out there doing work and making sure that even in her own little circles, like, hey, are you voting? Great. Like, I'll see you at the polls. If I don't see you by 6:30, like, I'm going to start calling. And then it was my father's mother who, really was standing up to a lot of systemic racism and a lot of very overt racism, and having crosses burned in their front yard, and still deciding that I'm gonna push through, like, I'm gonna work, and I'm going to make sure that my community is better off for the work that I'm doing. So those are kind of my three figures.
How
And Obama, like, I feel like you have to mention Obama.
Right. That was I can't imagine that there's well, I want to say anyone, but certainly I can't imagine there's a Democrat who would say that Obama didn't inspire them in some way. I'm as cynical as they get, and he made me think that, maybe things can be done in a civilized manner, and things can be done, progress can be made, and we can still get the things we want without compromising too much of what you went after in the first place. And so, so I appreciate you stepping outside of the box. I think we all tend to, because I would say that. I would have
Obama,
certainly said Barack Obama. So, talk a little bit about, as we finish up here, with Olivia Benson, a former state Senate candidate in the 37th district. That special election is this Tuesday, April 2nd, and a potential candidate. She says she may have an announcement soon for folks on running for state auditor general coming up. you mentioned a little bit. You mentioned your grandmother, dealing with racism in politics. How have you felt that through your time now working as a congressional aide and on different campaigns? And have you, and certainly as a Black woman, you're most qualified to speak about seeing and feeling this. How prevalent do you think it is today? Let's talk, mainly in this region, I think, obviously, because that's where we are. Where are we today in that sense?
I think that, racism, I think, as a lot of folks maybe have like pictures of it and images of it, doesn't necessarily exist in that same way today.
Right.
I heard a really great quote. I forget who it was, but they basically said, there was Jim Crow in the past, and now there's Jim Crow Esquire.
Right.
So it's much more, pervasive in the way that it's done, and it's not necessarily the folks in the white hoods, making comments and things. But I do think that there are opportunities, and I say opportunities lately, for communities, especially communities that maybe don't have a lot of diversity and maybe don't have a lot of, and that's diversity from, skin color to sexual identity, etc., that don't have them, that aren't necessarily faced with these things, and they're not sure how to have these conversations. So I do think that, we're living in a time, especially in Western Pennsylvania, which in Pittsburgh area, which is not as diverse as other kind of cities its size.
Right.
Some folks just aren't seeing it every day. And of course, right, like there's folks that, you can read the comment section on any, like, especially over the last 4 days. I'm saying don't necessarily read it, but you can read it. And see that there are some really archaic views out there around race and people of color, and that has to change. And that's not going to change from me, standing up at a nominating convention and saying, like, wait a second, like, this is not okay. That has to come from those folks in those communities that don't necessarily look like me, but that know that this is wrong, having those conversations with their peers and their neighbors. And
you brought up an interesting point about, and I think that for those that, continually say, I'm not racist, or this isn't a racist area. If you look at the comment section of any of the Post-Gazette, of the Trib, even some of the stuff that's shown up on ours, it's since the Antoine Rose verdict on Friday. I'm sorry, scratch that. The Michael Rosefeld verdict, the police officer who shot and killed Antoine Rose when he shot him in the back as he was fleeing, running away. I think that's important to say anytime you talk about this case. It's just the fact that folks are so blatantly out there. So in my mind, like I listened, I've read about the case. I understand the evidence. I understand when someone says to me, this, we had to follow the state law. I don't agree with that. I think that it came down to credibility of the police officer versus the credibility of what you saw of the witnesses. So I agree. I don't agree. I understand that the law is very specific, but I feel like there could have been some derivation there on how much you give a police officer, how much credence you give a police officer just because he's a police officer. But no one on the other side no one who believes that this police officer acted properly wants to talk about the fact that that he shot this young man in the back. And it's just sort of, and not only are they saying it, they're saying it in some of the most disgusting ways possible. And so, and again, it's not something that, that certainly, I can't imagine how it affects folks who are out there trying to fight against this and stop this and, try and make sure it's not their child, brother, sister. So I can't, that's obviously a big indicator of how Western Pennsylvania is.
And like there's a billboard in whatever county that is. And I think that's painful, right? That like we've taken, what we would hope, according to the jury foreman, was a fair trial. Mm-hmm. And regardless of what side folks were on, mm-hmm. like, you can have a discussion about like, wait a second, like, I don't like this verdict because, or mm-hmm. I like this verdict because, without bringing in these, painful stereotypes around African Americans in Pittsburgh and African American males specifically, especially when you have things going on nationally that really do reflect what's happened locally, and
Right.
the verdicts across the board have consistently kind of been the same. I think that, as communities, especially communities of color, really do wake up to this reality where justice may not be on your side at any point in time.
Right.
And there may be, this may happen again, that like it's just so hard to actually have faith in the justice system that, essentially wasn't designed kind of based on its origins for
Right.
African Americans
Right.
and, descendants of slaves specifically to have a fair shake and a fair shot at anything. And, where my concern is, so when I was at the city of Pittsburgh, I had the opportunity one summer to help coordinate the Cops and Kids program. And at the time, it was Commander Brackney. I believe she's in Charlottesville now. She's fantastic and great, and really did talk about how communities, and specifically police and all neighborhoods in the city of Pittsburgh, have this great opportunity to work together and stand up and do great things. But it can't just stay in the city of Pittsburgh, right? Like, it has to go to the suburbs. It has to go kind of spread beyond like these borders that we've set up for ourselves,
Right.
so that, we can have, a system that serves and protects everyone. And we can also have opportunities in, the safety of young Black men who, can go through a justice system without having one person that they encounter be judge, jury, and
Right.
executioner.
Absolutely. And that's I think the problem that everyone should have. You can argue about the law later, but it's almost seems that nobody wanted to have the discussion of whether he could, but whether or not he should have fired at Antoine Rose. So, but we're going to be discussing some of those things in the upcoming Pittsburgh issue of the Pittsburgh Current. I'll be discussing them anyway, as you can check those out. So, Olivia, thank you very much for being with us. So, what are you currently working on? Or what are you currently working with? I know that you have your own company.
Yes, I've had my own company for about 4 years. So I'm doing some cool things.
Yeah.
Not really ready to talk about them yet, 'cause
Okay.
they're still kind of under hurt. But I'm really excited about kind of where my future is heading.
That's great. Fantastic. We thank you very much for being here. We look forward to seeing where you're headed as well. Before we go today, though, I do want to talk about really quickly a GoFundMe project that has we talked to someone about last week on our Current Conversations, one of our new podcasts. We do apologize for using the word current so much, but it's so damn easy just to slide that in. But this is the Claritin, Pennsylvania Greenhouse Project, hashtag Claritin Grows. I donated to this, and I think that everyone else should too. It's a new look at how to solve the problem of food deserts in our communities, and these greenhouses can bring fresh vegetables, fresh fruits and vegetables to a community. I think it's a really stellar idea, and I think that everyone needs to get behind it. They're almost halfway to their goal of $6,000, and that $6,000 is going to go, just a long way. So I think everybody needs to check out the Claritin Grows. If you go to GoFundMe and you search for Claritin Grows, you'll be able to find that pretty easily. And we also, I believe, have a link on our PittsburghCurrent.com if you go to Current Conversations. So this has been the Pittsburgh Current podcast. I'm Charlie Deach. Look for the new issue of the Pittsburgh Current on April 2nd. Have a good day and have a good weekend.